So, what happens when you attack the United States of America? Well, you can expect a whole lot of hurt coming your way. In most cases. During Mexico, General Pershing's forces almost captured Pancho Villa. It was the Battle of Guerrero. The first encounter with Villista forces was a success for the 7th Cavalry. There was just one problem. Villa was not there when they made the attack. Pancho Villa was a wanted man. He had cut ties and allegiances to Venustiano Carranza, the head of the Constitutionalist Party that defeated General Victoriano Huerta, who was the successful leader of the coup against the legally elected Francisco Maduro. Villa was now considered a rebel by Carranza. He was also wanted by the United States of America for the killing of 7 U.S. soldiers and the murder of 8 civilians when he and his band of rebels attacked the border town of Columbus, New Mexico on March 9, 1916. Now, why would Villa attack an American town? Pancho Villa had lost the support of the American government when President Woodrow Wilson on October 19, 1915 recognized the Carranza government as the chief executive of the de facto government of Mexico. Now, once Wilson made that decision, the telegram went out from the State Department addressed to the confidential agents of the de facto government of Mexico, Department of State, Washington, October 19, 1915. My dear Mr. Arredondo, it is my pleasure to inform you that the President of the United States takes this opportunity of extending recognition to the de facto government of Mexico, of which General Carranza is the chief executive. The government of the United States will be pleased to receive formally in Washington a diplomatic representative of the de facto government as soon as it shall please General Carranza to designate and appoint such a representative. And the reciprocal, the government of the United States will accredit to the de facto government a diplomatic representative as soon as the President has had the opportunity to designate such a representative. I should appreciate it if you could find it possible to communicate this information to General Carranza at the earliest convenience. Very sincerely yours, Robert Lansing. So it seemed that Villa's usefulness was used up. Wilson dropped him quicker than a politician dumps a whistleblower who can't provide the goods. To say Villa was upset was an understatement. His friendly relationship with the United States was over. Villa was going to make President Wilson pay for what he believed was a betrayal. Now, Villa's plan was to get back at America and Wilson. In January 1916, Villa took 18 Americans off a train in northern Mexico and brutally executed them. He then made 2 small raids on the Texas town of Glen Springs and Boquilas in May. It was the attack Villa made on Columbus, New Mexico that finally forced President Wilson's hand. After considerable pressure from the public and Congress, Wilson ordered an expedition to enter Mexico and get Villa. 6 days after Villa's attack in Columbus, the punitive expedition began crossing the border into Chihuahua, Mexico. Their mission was to capture or kill Pancho Villa. There was one major obstacle to completing this mission. This was Pancho Villa's backyard. He knew every mountain range and pass, every little village and town. The people of Chihuahua would protect Villa from the gringos. So on March 10, 1916, Major General Frederick Funston, commanding general of the Southern Department, sent a telegram to the Adjutant General of the War Department, stating in part, "It is the opinion of Colonels Dodd and Slocum, in which I concur, that unless Villa is relentlessly pursued and his forces scattered, he will continue raids, as troops of Mexican government are accomplishing nothing, and as he can consequently make his preparations and concentrations without being disturbed, he can strike at any point on the border." Now, the pressure from the Army, Congress, and the American public was too much for Wilson to ignore. In response to Funston's telegram, later that same day, President Wilson gave the order to send an expedition to capture Villa. The Adjutant General of the War Department sent the following telegram to Major General Frederick Funston, Commanding General of the Army, Southern Department, Fort Sam Houston, Texas. Adjutant General to General Funston, War Department, Washington, March 10, 1916. The President has directed that an armed force be sent into Mexico with the sole object of capturing Villa and preventing any further raids by his band And with scrupulous regard to the sovereignty of Mexico, Secretary of War directs you telegraph exactly what you need in order to carry out foregoing general instructions, but you will not take any overt steps until receipt definite orders from War Department. Signed, McCain. Now, Funston naturally assumed he'd be in command of the expedition. He was quickly disabused of that assumption. There was another general officer stationed in the Southern Department by the name of John J. Pershing. Pershing had served with Teddy Roosevelt in Cuba. Pershing and his 10th Cavalry would kettle in San Juan Hill when Roosevelt became president. He pushed for Pershing to be promoted to colonel. Even though he was president, Roosevelt could not get around the Army's promotion system of seniority. This situation would change, however. In 1905, Pershing married Helen Frances Warren, the daughter of the powerful U.S. Senator Francis E. Warren. Now, by 1905, President Roosevelt and Senator Warren were able to push through Pershing's promotion to Brigadier General. Pershing had jumped 3 ranks and bypassed about 835 officers. Now, Pershing wasn't the only younger officer to be promoted like that. There were other junior officers who were promoted to Brigadier General over their peers. Now, the decision as to who would lead the expedition to get Villa was Major General Hugh Scott, Army Chief of Staff. Now, Scott selected Brigadier General Pershing over Funston to lead the expedition. Pershing's military record was admirable. However, it was not Pershing's fighting record that impressed Scott, but his competence in diplomacy he had shown during his service in the Philippines and China, a skill Scott believed necessary for the upcoming expedition. Funston was not pleased with the decision, and since Funston was in command of the Southern Department, Pershing would have to report directly to Funston. Funston was determined to control the expedition while allowing Pershing control over the troops in the field. On March 11, 1916, Pershing received his official orders. The Secretary of War has designated you to command expedition into Mexico to capture Villa and his bandits. There will be 2 columns, one to enter from Columbus and one from Hasita via Culberson's Ranch. Hasita column will consist of 7th Cavalry, 10th Cavalry less 2 troops, 1 battery of horse artillery. Columbus column will consist of 13th Cavalry less 1 troop, a regiment of cavalry from the east, 1 battery of our horse artillery, 1 company of engineers, and the 1st Aero Squadron with 8 planes. Reinforced brigade of the 6th Infantry, 16th Infantry, 1st Battalion, 4th Field Artillery, and auxiliary troops will follow Columbus column. 2 companies of engineers will be ordered to Fort Bliss awaiting further orders. Necessary signal corps will be ordered from here. We'll furnish War Department instructions later. Have you any recommendations to make? Signed, Bundy. The Army also assigned a detachment of 24 U.S. Scouts to accompany each column. The Scouts were composed of Apache men recruited into the Army for their expertise in tracking and operating in the inhospitable terrain of the border region. The National Guard was called up to provide support for the expedition. At its full strength, Pershing's expedition would have a total of 10,000 men participating in one form or another. With this many men going after Villa, everybody believed he would be killed or captured in a relatively short time. What Wilson and the American public did not realize was that Villa was a hero to a vast number of Mexicans who would do whatever they could to help him, while other Mexicans feared reprisals if they helped Americans. One administration official understood the dangers of the situation. Pershing was counseled by Secretary of War Newton Baker. The greatest caution will be exercised after crossing the border that fire is not opened on troops pertaining to the de facto government of Mexico, as such troops are very likely to be found in country which you will traverse. The greatest care and discretion will have to be exercised by all. Now, while Pershing was organizing his forces, the diplomatic cables were flying back and forth between the State Department and the American consuls in Mexico. Carranza was not pleased with the U.S. plan to invade Mexico. It took some maneuvering to get Carranza to agree to let American forces cross the border to go after Villa. However, he would do whatever he could to impede the expedition's progress. By March 15th, Pershing had his forces organized and ready to go. He split his force into 2 columns. The west column would leave from Culberson Ranch. The east column would leave from Columbus, New Mexico, which was rapidly being built up into the main supply base for the expedition. Now, the eastern column crossed the border on the 15th of March, passing through Las Palomas border gate. The Mexican detachment stationed there had fled earlier that morning. Problems with Pershing's touring car delayed the Western Column's departure until the following day. Now, Pershing's column reached Colonia Dublin at about 19:30 hours on the 17th of March, where Pershing established his headquarters. Now, the general chose the location for access to the Casas Grandes River and Mexico's Northwestern Railway, as well as proximity to the Mormon settlement. The Mormons welcomed and readily aided the expedition by providing a place to camp, access to supplies, and sources of intelligence. In return, the Army provided protection from the local bandits who preyed on foreigners living and working in Chihuahua, as well as anti-American revolutionaries operating in the area. Now, once Pershing established his headquarters, he held a staff meeting to plan the operation. Intelligence reports said Villa had been seen about 60 miles to the south in the vicinity of San Miguel de Babacora. Seeing an opportunity to quickly accomplish the mission, Pershing acted. Even though his eastern column was still en route, Pershing sent out 3 columns. Now, keeping the 3rd Squadron of the 10th Cavalry at Colonia Dublin, he formed 3 forces from the remaining units. With 1 column, the entire 7th Cavalry, that's 1,200 men, commanded by Colonel James B. Irwin, would advance south through Galena and El Valley, and then move east in the direction of the Sierra Madre Oriental Mountains in the hopes of catching Villa or his bands if they tried to ride east from Babacora. The other 2 detachments were to proceed to Babacora itself. Now, the men of the 10th had been in the saddle for at least 24 hours, some even longer. They needed some rest. Pershing decided to send these 2 detachments by rail. The 10th Cavalry 2nd Squadron, 100 men, reinforced with regimental machine gun troops and commanded by Lieutenant Colonel William C. Brown, would leave the train at El Ruscio, that's a railroad station 40 miles north of Babacora, and advance south. Meanwhile, the 1st Squadron, with 100 men, commanded by Major Elwood W. Evans, was supposed to unload at Madera, about 28 miles south of Babacora, and advance north. Pershing's plan was to hit Villa with the 7th Cavalry and push Villa's forces into the 2 converging columns. It was a sound plan tactically. However, there was weakness to the plan. The weakness to the plan was the railroads and the railroad cars. When the trains arrived at Colonia Dublin, they were in no shape to transport soldiers and their horses and equipment. Modifications and repairs had to be made. Doors were repaired, ventilation holes cut into the walls, and large gaps in the floors caused by old cooking fires had to be repaired. After several hours of work, Lieutenant Colonel William C. Brown and Major Evans' command left Colonia Dublin. The first stop was Casa Grandes, a few miles south of Colonia Dublin. Now, the conductor refused to stop for much needed fuel. He was afraid of retribution from either Villa forces or Carranza's forces for helping the Americans. Colonel Brown had no choice but to return to Colonia Dublin. Colonel Brown had no choice but to have his men scavenge the necessary fuel. The troops set to work ripping down loading pens and chopping down telegraph poles to get enough wood for the trip. Now, since the troops destroyed private property, the U.S. government had to cough up the dough to pay for the damages. Now, once they had a full load of wood, the train continued on its mission for a few miles. It seemed they lacked enough water to make the complete journey, so the train went back to Colonia Dublin. Now, with enough wood and water for the journey, the conductor then refused to proceed to El Ruscio. Colonel Brown had to bribe the conductor to get them to El Ruscio. Just outside of El Ruscio lay a steep grade. The locomotive could not pull the 25 loaded cattle and boxcars up the grade. It was just after midnight on March 20th when Colonel Brown, fed up with the whole situation, ordered his men off the train and continued the mission on horseback. However, with the train lightened, Major Evans kept his detachment on board, planning to ride it to Madera. However, 2 cars derailed and plunged down an embankment near Cumbrae Pass, injuring 11 men. Evans then ordered the 1st Squadron off the train and did a night march to Babacora. Shortly after he arrived, he received orders to join Brown. Now, the 2 men met outside Babacora on March 24th at about 2 p.m. In the meantime, Colonel Irwin's forces continued to patrol east of Babacora. It was quickly learned that Villa had not been in the area for several months. For the next 32 days, the strike force patrolled the Babacora region, believing Villa was somewhere in the area. This first foray into Chihuahua, Mexico was a failure. The troopers relied on the Mexican citizens they met along the trail for information. They received little useful intelligence. Whether it was a peasant or the town folks, the citizens of Mexico saw the American army as invaders, so any information they received was dubious at best. This was Villa's backyard. He knew the terrain, all the possible escape routes, and more importantly, he knew all the hideouts. Since the Americans were restricted to the Chihuahua area, Villa could easily cross over into the Durango district and escape. If it became too hot, the Americans could not pursue him. Now, relations would become worse with the Carranza government as the days passed, making an extremely difficult mission almost impossible. Now, once the Eastern Column had arrived in Colonial Dublin, Pershing divided his cavalry forces into 4 detachments. In total, the Eastern Column had approximately 600 men. These were the flying columns, which would operate independently and collect intelligence on Villa's whereabouts. By the time the Eastern Column detachments entered Babacora Operation Zone, Pershing merged the troops from the 10th Cavalry with the troops of the 7th Cavalry. Commanding this unit was 63-year-old Colonel Dodd. Now, this is an interesting character. Colonel Dodd had entered the United States Military Academy in 1872. For 27 years of his career, he served in the 3rd Cavalry during the Indian Wars in Cuba, in 1898 seeing action at San Juan Hill and the Siege of Santiago, where he was wounded. After the Spanish-American War, Dodd was sent to the Philippines as part of the American force sent there to quell the Philippine Rebellion. By the time of the Villa expedition, Dodd had served 44 years in the U.S. Army. He was within months of mandatory retirement. A United Press article of the time described Colonel Dodd as rangy, raw-boned, and hard-looking. Dodd pushed his men hard. The news reports in March 23, 1916, Williston Graphic stated, Dodd and his column traveled 50 miles over rough desert in 24 hours. As Dodd and his column moved southward, they would rely on local garrison commander and federal soldiers for information on Villa's whereabouts. When the column reached the village of El Valle, 25 miles south of Colonial Dublin, Dodd conferred with the garrison commander, Enrique Salas, on the latest reports of Villa's location. The latest intelligence placed Villa 40 miles further south near Namacupa. Dodd took Salinas' information at face value. However, by the time the column reached Namacupa, Villa was gone. After questioning the locals, Dodd realized their information was less than accurate. Dodd's column continued heading south to the village of Villa. It was here that Dodd decided to ignore orders to hold until he could be reinforced. Dodd was an old Indian fighter, and his experience told him he was on the right track. Based upon his experience and judgment, Dodd decided to head southwest. Dodd and his men had been out of touch with headquarters until March 26. Pershing's headquarters at Colonial Dublin received information that Villa was going to attack the town of Guerrero. Orders were given to the 1st Aero Squadron to locate Colonel Dodd's column and relay the information. This was easier said than done. Now, Colonel Dodd was a relentless driver, and by March 26, his column was moving up the sides of the Sierra Madres across the Continental Divide. However, to get to Guerrero, the column had to cross the Sierra Madres Mountains. For this, Dodd needed a local guide. Finding a local guide to help the Americans was not easy. Villa had passed through the area after the Columbus attack. He needed troops, so he was on a recruiting drive. He would tell the locals that he would only attack the Americans, and when the Americans invaded, it would be with the approval of the de facto Carranza government. None of the locals were willing to risk their lives for the Americans. Dodd was finally able to convince one local to lead his column over the treacherous mountain trails. While Dodd was following the local guide, Villa struck Guerrero before dawn on March 28, catching the garrison asleep and capturing the town without a shot. Across the river from Guerrero, at the village of San Isidoro, a detachment under Carrista's General Jose Cavazos stopped Villa and his band and routed them in a disorganized retreat. It was during this raid that Villa was shot in the leg and badly wounded. Villa's men took him to a nearby home of Dr. Lyman B. Rauschbaum for treatment. Rauschbaum advised Villa to have surgery to remove the bone fragments from his wound, but the general refused to stay for the procedure. Realizing that the U.S. and Carranza's forces would soon learn of his injury and come looking for him, Villa ordered Brigadier General Nicolas Fernandez his principal subordinate on the Columbus raid, and a small escort to take him into the mountains to hide. It was here that Villa would hide out while the Battle of Guerrero took place. The forced march through the Sierra Madres was a killing experience for man and beast. Darkness, freezing rain, snow dogged the column as it climbed steep slopes and crossed almost impassable terrain. Despite inadequate maps and an unreliable guide, the cavalry covered 50 miles that night. Now, by the time Colonel Dodd and his column had crossed the mountains and were outside of the town of Guerrero, they had traveled twice the distance than necessary. For whatever reason, fear of Villa and his men or hatred of the gringos, the local guide took the column on a roundabout route that guaranteed to double the distance. So instead of going 22 miles through rough terrain, they covered 50 miles of rough terrain. Dodd had achieved surprise, but he and his exhausted men had to attack a possibly fortified town in daylight due to the guide's duplicitous behavior on the trail and his refusal to guide the troops into safe attacking positions while it was still dark. Dodd had no choice but to surround the town and wait for daylight. The odds were definitely against Colonel Dodd and success. General Pershing's report on Guerrero had a section describing the terrain Dodd was dealing with. Guerrero is located in a valley surrounded by high bluffs and can only be seen from the east when one is directly over it. The bluffs are almost sheer, in many places impassable, and are cut by impassable arroyos running well back into the upper plain. Now, arroyos are narrow, steep-sided gullies formed by the action of fast-flowing water and arid or semi-arid regions found chiefly in the southwest United States. Now, the main road from the east follows down a very steep spur or hogsback, while on the west there are bluffs extending well back into the mountains, but not so steep or abrupt as those on the east. Now, these are cut by deep and partially wooded arroyos, difficult of passage. Thus, the place is not easily surprised by the day. So anyways, Dodd and his 370 men were 3 miles south of Guerrero. Intelligence believed there were approximately 500 of Villa's men in Guerrero. It was daylight. The men were worn out due to the 55-mile forced march over the Sierra Madre Mountains in the dark and extreme weather conditions. Dodd could not rest his men and horses. He had no choice. He had to attack without that element of surprise. Now, some of the Villistas thought better of it and headed for the hills while they still had time once they saw Dodd's forces coming. The attack began around 8 a.m. Dodd sent the 2nd Squadron across the river to block an escape west of the town. He then led the 1st and 3rd Squadrons against the main Villista forces in what had been called the last great cavalry charge. Some of the Villistas inside the town fought a rearguard action, giving what cover they could to allow their comrades to escape. Now, in the heat of battle, the Villistas were able to escape into the mountains via the many trails and arroyos. The American cavalry broke up into small units and chased after the Villistas. Dodd led one small unit on a chase of about 10 miles through the arroyos before U.S. troops set up a rifle and machine gun position. Small bands of American cavalry chased Villa's men in a running gun battle that lasted for about 10 miles. In his report, Colonel Dodd stated, "The attack resulted in breaking up and scattering of Villa's forces, the greater portion of them being driven in a 10-mile running fight into the mountains northeast of the railroad, where after brisk skirmishing they separated into small bands, and our horses were too weak to follow them further." U.S. forces killed about 30 Villistas as they tried to escape through the narrow canyons. At the same time, another troop of the 7th Cavalry spotted a group of armed men with whom initially suspected of being Villistas. Before they could engage, the cavalrymen noticed that the suspects moved in an orderly column with a large Mexican flag. So the U.S. troopers held their fire, concerned they might attack Carranza's forces in error. Now, these men were being held for execution by the Villistas. Besides saving these Carranza forces and avoiding a major political incident, Dodd's troops managed to capture 2 machine guns plus a number of horses and saddles, while only sustaining 4 slightly wounded troopers. Now, this was the first engagement with Villa's forces. The mission was a partial success. Now, even though Villa was not at Guerrero, Colonel Dodd was able to scatter Villa's men. As newspaper reports have a habit of doing even today, they portrayed the attack as a huge American success and intimating that it would be only days before Villa was captured. For the next few days, American papers had banner headlines telling how Colonel Dodd's attack was a success. They were always close to catching the outlaw bandit. In reality, the punitive expedition would chase Pancho Villa around northern Mexico for over a year and never even get close to capturing him. As a matter of fact, Guerrero was the closest the U.S. Army ever came to capturing Villa. So, what have we learned from this slice of history? Well, just because you have a larger and stronger force doesn't necessarily guarantee success. Not all guerrilla leaders are successful. Some do wind up dead. Just saying, it's something to think about. Che Guevara is a perfect example. And one last thing, if you ever find yourself as a guerrilla leader, don't poke the bear. Look what happened to Osama bin Laden and that other guy, Qasem Soleimani. Navy SEALs don't mess around. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. But most importantly, leave a comment below and please share this video with your friends. Thank you for watching.